On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the Port of Vancouver is in the midst of a labor dispute. Sorry. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. My apologies for getting late to this. This has been going on for a few days, but there's been a little bit of an election here south of the 49th parallel. It's kept everyone busy, at least in the United States, maybe even the rest of the world, but doesn't excuse me for not getting to this because this is of utmost importance to everybody in and around Canada. A labor strike / lockout, we'll talk about why this is both a strike and a lockout in a minute, has embroiled the Port of Vancouver, but it's having impacts not just in Vancouver, but across the British Columbia and actually across the rails and all the way to the eastern shores of Canada. We're going to break this down, tell you what's happening as of today and what we can expect to see happen in the future. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. This story over at FreightWaves: Lockout stalls more container ships outside Western Canadian ports. Union contract fight has halted container handling. Story goes on. Container ships continue to line up outside Canada's busiest import gateway as carriers wait for a lockout of union longshore employees to end. On Monday, 704 persons represented by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILW. This is the Canadian version of the ILW. Remember, we had the port negotiations between the ILW and the Pacific Maritime Association on the West Coast. We are in the midst of issues on the East Coast. That is the ILA. That is the International Longshoremen's Association. But in this, the ILW Local 514 was locked out by ocean carriers and terminal operators represented by the British Columbia Maritime Employees Association, the BCMEA, at the West Coast ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert, after the union rejected what the employees group said was its, quote, final contract offer. The union also is objecting to the introduction of automation in port operations, very similar to what we saw going on the East and Gulf Coast ports with issues over automation and obviously pay. This story over at Maritime Executive. Vessels pile up as Foreman lockout continues at Canada's West Coast ports. The BC Maritime Employers Association told the Canada Press there's been no engagement with the local representing the foreman or federal mediators since the lockout began Monday afternoon. The employees continue to blame the local for calling a strike while saying the offer they presented is the same as what the Longshoremen Union accepted in July 2023. They have also added provisions to address the foreman's issues while saying it does not require any concessions of the union, nor to waive the technological change notice provision. The association representing the employers has repeatedly called this is its final offer in the contract negotiations that date back to March of 2023. They, however, said without qualifying that the employers may be required to reassess their position on the current offer. The strike is impacting all the container terminals included in Vancouver, which accounts for 40% of the cargo movement in Canada. General cargo and some bulk are impacted, but not grain or cruise ships. The story I want to reference as I show you what's going on in Vancouver is this story over in Lodestar. Canadian forwarders extremely frustrated by lack of action to end port strike. This is the Port of Vancouver, brought to you by Marine Traffic. These are the ships destined for the port. In the story from Lodestar, the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association told Lodestar, quote, both ports on the West Coast and 40% of capacity at the Port of Montreal are closed. She added the railways have placed an embargo on moving containers to these locations. The Port of Vancouver says it remains open and we continue to manage high demand for our anchorages. The port goes on. This includes working closely with industry to maintain fluidity by optimizing anchorage utilization and prioritizing anchorage assignments to terminals that remain open. Centerm, Deltaport, Fraser-Surrey, and Vanterm container terminals are all impacted. As of yesterday at 6 a.m., anchorage utilization at Vancouver was at 85% and at Southern Gulf Island 63%. And Vancouver Fraser Port Authority warned that there was limited anchorage capacity. Vessels currently anchor outside Port Authority jurisdiction include the Eversteady, Marcos 5, SM Qingdao. They're all located here off of Victoria right now. According to Hapag Lloyd, yard utilization at Prince Rupert is low at 63%, import ground counts are low, and dwell times are approximately 1.8 days. Meanwhile, negotiations between the Maritime Employers Association and Dock Workers Union, CUP Local 375 on the Canadian West Coast, are ongoing, but, quote, the Montreal Port Authority is not at the bargaining table. Operations at Montreal have been halted since 31 October. The dispute centered on the 2 container terminals operated by Termont, which handles some 40% of volume. Story goes on, we are frustrated with the lack of progress across all parties. Freight will have to be diverted to functioning ports in Canada and the U.S., but even this contingency leaves shippers and forwarders with few options, especially when considering the looming January deadline for the threat of renewed U.S. East and Gulf Coast dock workers strike. So obviously a lot of turmoil going on both the East and West Coast of Canada, Port of Montreal, Port of Vancouver. Let's go take a look at what the Port of Vancouver is saying directly. Let's take a look at the 4 notices put out by the Port of Vancouver regarding this event. They expect disruptions to begin at 0800 Pacific Standard Time on Monday, November 4th. The ILWU Local 514 issued a 72-hour strike notice, followed by the BCMEA issuing a 72-hour lockout notice. Hence, this is both a strike and a lockout. The BC coastwise labor dispute will impact operations at members' terminals where Local 514 is employed. At this time, we expect grain and cruise operations, along with operations at the West Shore Coal Terminal, to continue at the Port of Vancouver. This is the November 4 update on the story. A coastwise labor dispute involving the ILWU and BCMEA is impacting operations at some Port of Vancouver terminals as of today. The November 5th notice continued the same. The most recent notice comes out November 6th. I want to take a moment and take a look at this. There have been no changes to the coastwise job action involving ILWU Local 514 and the BCMEA. Port of Vancouver remains open, and we continue to manage high demand for anchorages. When you look at the different sectors here, the auto sector operations are impacted. Break bulk is impacted. Bulk sector, grain operations, and operations at West Shore Coal Terminal have not been affected. They continue to move goods. Most petroleum products also continue to move. Operations for other commodities are impacted. On the container sector, Centerm, Delta Port, Fraser Surrey, and Vanterm container terminals are impacted. The cruise sector is not impacted because the cruise season ended on October 29th. Rail, there are embargoes in place, meaning there's no rail movement either in or out of the anchorages. Rail has embargoes in place, meaning there's no movement of rail in and out of the port. There is currently limited anchorage capacity at the port due to recent inclement weather and seasonal demand, including grain exports being in their peak shipping period. And you saw that with the ships anchored directly off the Port of Vancouver. This is the notice from the Port of Montreal, October 31st. This morning at 11 a.m., an indefinite strike began at the Viau and Maisonneuve terminals in accordance with the strike notice filed by CUP Local 375, the Longshore Workers Union. As a result, these 2 Termont-operated terminals are closed, and no rail, truck, or ship service will be provided, with 40% of total container handling capacity paralyzed by this workers' stoppage. And ships and trains already obliged to choose other routes, the Montreal Port Authority expressed its deep concern about the negative repercussions of this work stoppage. So we have a stoppage in the Port of Montreal. We're seeing no containers moving into the port through that. About 40% of the total container handling capacity is out for the Port of Montreal. And now we have Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and British Columbia that is out. This obviously impacts Canada greatly. Add to it, rail is not coming in there. Story I should have gotten to sooner. My apologies. Obviously, this is crucial for what is happening in Canada. I hope you found today's episode interesting. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon, become a monthly or yearly subscriber. We will keep you up to date on what's happening up in Canada regarding the strikes, along with everything else that's going on around the world, like there's not enough going on. So next episode is Sal, signing off.